What happens when a moment of vulnerability becomes a revelation of strength? When Commander Sarah Mitchell stepped onto that stage for what should have been a routine ceremony, she never imagined that a wardrobe malfunction would expose not just her skin, but a secret that would shake the very foundations of the Navy SEAL community. The tattoo on her back wasn't just ink and art, it was a map to a truth so powerful that it made the toughest warriors in the world stop in their tracks. This is the story of how one woman's past collided with her present in the most unexpected way, revealing connections that would change everything for everyone involved. The California sun beat down mercilessly on Naval Base Coronado as hundreds of family members, military personnel, and distinguished guests gathered for the annual Navy SEAL recognition ceremony. Commander Sarah Mitchell stood in formation with her fellow officers, her crisp white dress uniform immaculate despite the sweltering heat. At 34, she had earned her place among the Navy's elite through years of dedication, sacrifice, and an unwavering commitment that had cost her more than most people would ever know. Sarah's hands remained steady at her sides, though her heart raced slightly as she watched the crowd. These ceremonies always made her nervous, not because of the attention, but because of the memories they stirred. Today was supposed to be special. She was receiving a commendation for her work in developing new training protocols that had already saved lives in the field. Her innovations in combat medicine had revolutionized how SEALs approached battlefield trauma, and the Navy wanted to recognize her contributions publicly. As the ceremony began, Admiral Richardson took the podium, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd through the sound system. Sarah half listened to the opening remarks, her mind wandering to the phone call she'd received from her sister the night before. Emma had been excited about the ceremony, proud of her big sister's accomplishments, but there had been something else in her voice, a hesitation that Sarah couldn't quite place. The morning had started like any other. Sarah had risen at 0500, completed her usual workout routine, and carefully prepared her uniform. Every ribbon, every pin was exactly where it should be. She had served for over a decade, rising through the ranks faster than most, earning respect in a world dominated by men who initially questioned whether a woman belonged in their elite community. She had proven them wrong time and time again, but the weight of that constant proving had left its mark on her soul. Lieutenant Commander Jake Torres stood 3 positions down from Sarah in the formation. At 6'2" with graying temples that made him look distinguished rather than old, Jake was a legend in the SEAL community. He had led more successful missions than most people had hot dinners, and his reputation for bringing his men home alive was unmatched. At 41, he was considering retirement, thinking about what came after a life defined by service to country and brotherhood forged in the crucible of combat. Jake had noticed Sarah the moment she arrived at Coronado 2 years ago. It wasn't just her competence that impressed him, though she was undoubtedly one of the most skilled medical officers he had ever worked with. There was something about her, a quiet strength that reminded him of warriors he had known and lost. She carried herself with the confidence of someone who had seen the worst humanity had to offer and had chosen to keep fighting anyway. Today, as Jake stood in formation, he found his eyes drifting towards Sarah more often than he cared to admit. He had been fighting his growing feelings for months, telling himself that their professional relationship was too important to complicate with personal emotions. The SEAL teams were a tight community, and relationships between officers could create complications that might endanger lives in the field. The ceremony progressed through its scheduled elements. Citations were read, medals were awarded, and families beamed with pride as their loved ones were recognized for their service. Sarah's stomach tightened as her name approached on the program. She had always preferred working behind the scenes, saving lives rather than being celebrated for it. The attention felt uncomfortable, like wearing someone else's uniform. Admiral Richardson called her name, and Sarah stepped forward with practiced military precision. The crowd applauded as she approached the podium, her movements fluid and confident despite the anxiety she felt inside. As she reached the platform, she noticed a photographer adjusting his position to get a better angle. The bright sun created a glare that made her squint slightly as she prepared to receive her commendation. What happened next would replay in her mind for years to come. As Sarah stood at attention while the Admiral read her citation, a sudden gust of wind caught the ceremony tent, causing one of the support poles to shift. The photographer, trying to avoid the swaying fabric, stepped backward and accidentally bumped into a table holding a display of historical artifacts. The table wobbled, and a heavy bronze sculpture began to fall. Without thinking, Sarah lunged forward to catch the falling piece, her training taking over as she prioritized protecting others over protocol. Her movement was quick and graceful, and she successfully caught the sculpture before it could hit Admiral Richardson. However, her sudden motion caused her uniform jacket to catch on the corner of the table, and the fabric tore along a seam that had been weakened by years of wear. The tear ran from her left shoulder blade down to her mid-back, exposing a large portion of her upper back to the assembled crowd. Gasps rippled through the audience as Sarah's white undershirt was revealed, but it wasn't the impropriety that caused the reactions. It was the tattoo that was now visible through her thin undershirt, a detailed, artistic piece that seemed to tell a story all its own. Jake's breath caught in his throat as he saw the tattoo clearly for the first time. The design was intricate and meaningful, obviously not the result of a spontaneous decision. At the center was a military dog tag surrounded by angel wings, with coordinates written in flowing script beneath. But it was the name on the dog tag that made Jake's world suddenly tilt off its axis: Marcus Torres, Kia 2019. The blood drained from Jake's face as he stared at his brother's name tattooed on Sarah's back. Marcus had been killed in action 5 years ago during a classified mission in Syria. Jake had been leading a different operation on the other side of the country when it happened, and the guilt of not being there to protect his younger brother had eaten at him ever since. Marcus had been a combat medic, brilliant and brave, with dreams of becoming a doctor after his service ended. Those dreams had died with him in a bombed-out building in Aleppo. Sarah felt the cool air on her exposed back and immediately understood what had happened. She had always been careful to keep her tattoo hidden beneath her uniform, knowing that questions about it would lead to conversations she wasn't ready to have. The tattoo was private, sacred, a tribute to someone who had meant everything to her and whose loss had nearly destroyed her. Admiral Richardson quickly stepped forward, removing his own jacket to drape over Sarah's shoulders. His actions were smooth and practiced, covering the exposure while maintaining the dignity of the ceremony. But Jake had seen enough. His hands trembled slightly as the implications hit him like a physical blow. Sarah Mitchell, the woman he had been falling for, was connected to his dead brother in a way he couldn't yet comprehend. The ceremony continued, but Jake heard nothing. His mind raced with questions and possibilities, each more painful than the last. How had Sarah known Marcus? Why did she have his name tattooed on her body? The coordinates beneath the name, did they mark where he had died? Jake's training told him to remain at attention, to maintain discipline, but every instinct screamed at him to break formation and demand answers. Sarah received her commendation with as much grace as she could muster, thanking Admiral Richardson and the assembled crowd while acutely aware of the whispered conversations her wardrobe malfunction had created. She could feel eyes on her, some sympathetic, others curious. But there was one gaze that felt different, intense and searching in a way that made her skin prickle with awareness. When she finally returned to formation, Sarah's eyes found Jake's across the ranks. The expression on his face was unlike anything she had ever seen from him, a mixture of shock, grief, and something that might have been recognition. In that moment, she realized with growing horror that he might have seen the tattoo. More than that, he might have understood what it meant. Jake's mind was spinning through memories of his brother's letters home. Marcus had mentioned a female medic he was working with, someone he called Angel because of her skill at saving lives in impossible situations. In his final letter, Marcus had written about someone special, a woman who understood him in a way no one else had. He had been planning to tell Jake about her when he returned from his deployment. That conversation never came. As the ceremony concluded and the formation began to disperse, Jake found himself walking towards Sarah without conscious decision. His legs carried him forward while his mind struggled to process what he had discovered. Sarah saw him approaching and felt a familiar mixture of attraction and apprehension. She had been drawn to Jake from the moment they first worked together, but she had also sensed something deeper, a pain that mirrored her own, a loss that shaped him in ways he rarely let show. "Commander Mitchell," Jake said, his voice rougher than usual. "Could I speak with you privately?" Sarah nodded, unable to trust her voice. She followed Jake away from the dispersing crowd, toward a quiet area near the training facilities. With each step, her heart pounded harder, and she found herself preparing for a conversation that would change everything between them. The weight of Admiral Richardson's jacket on her shoulders felt heavier than any gear she had ever carried in the field. Beneath it, her tattoo seemed to burn against her skin, as if the exposure to sunlight had awakened the memories embedded in its ink. She thought of Marcus, of the promises she had made to him and to herself, and wondered if the carefully constructed wall she had built around her heart was about to come crashing down. Jake stopped walking when they reached a secluded spot overlooking the Pacific Ocean. The ceremony sounds faded behind them, replaced by the eternal rhythm of waves against the shore. For a long moment, neither spoke. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unasked questions and unspoken truths. "The name on your back," Jake said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Marcus Torres. He was my brother." Sarah's worst fears crystallized in that simple statement. The universe, it seemed, had a cruel sense of timing. She closed her eyes and took a shaky breath, feeling as though the carefully ordered world she had built for herself was suddenly tilting toward chaos. Sarah's legs nearly gave out beneath her as Jake's words hit her like a physical blow. She gripped the railing overlooking the ocean, her knuckles white with the force of her hold. The brother Marcus had talked about endlessly, the hero he looked up to, the family he missed desperately. It was Jake. The man she had been falling for was connected to the greatest love and loss of her life in the cruelest way imaginable. "You knew him," Jake continued, his voice breaking slightly. "The tattoo, those coordinates, they're where he died, aren't they?" Sarah turned to face him, tears threatening to spill from her eyes. Admiral Richardson's jacket slipped slightly from her shoulders, but she pulled it tighter around herself, as if it could shield her from the pain of this moment. "Yes," she whispered, the word barely audible over the sound of crashing waves. "I knew him. I loved him." Jake stepped back as if she had struck him. The confirmation of what he had suspected hit him harder than any enemy fire he had ever faced. His brother, his baby brother whom he had promised their dying father he would protect, had found love with this woman standing before him. The same woman who had been occupying Jake's thoughts and dreams for months. "How?" Jake asked, his voice raw with emotion. "How did you two?" Sarah took a shaky breath, gathering the courage to tell a story she had never shared with anyone. "We were stationed together at a forward operating base in Syria. I was part of a medical unit providing support for special operations. Marcus was assigned to our team as a combat medic." She paused, watching Jake's face carefully. "He saved my life on my first day there." The memory came flooding back with painful clarity. Sarah had been 29, fresh from advanced trauma training, confident in her abilities but unprepared for the reality of combat medicine in an active war zone. She had thought she understood pressure, having worked in busy emergency rooms stateside, but nothing had prepared her for treating wounded soldiers while mortars exploded around them. "There was an ambush," Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger as she fell into the familiar rhythm of a military briefing. "Our convoy was hit by an IED, and we had multiple casualties. I was trying to treat a soldier with a severed artery when sniper fire started coming from a building about 200 meters out. I froze." Jake listened intently, every word painting a picture of his brother that both broke his heart and filled him with pride. Marcus had always been the brave one, the one who ran toward danger while others ran away. Even as children, Marcus had been the one to chase away bullies, to speak up for those who couldn't speak for themselves. "Marcus appeared out of nowhere," Sarah said, her voice softening with the memory. "He dove on top of me, shielding me from the sniper fire while still helping me work on the wounded soldier. He talked me through the procedure, his voice calm and steady even though bullets were flying over our heads. He saved 3 lives that day, mine, the wounded soldier's, and a local civilian who got caught in the crossfire." Jake closed his eyes, able to picture the scene perfectly. It was exactly something Marcus would do, put himself in harm's way to protect others without a second thought. Their father had always said that Marcus had too much heart for his own good, that his compassion would either make him a great healer or get him killed. In the end, it had done both. "After that day, we were inseparable," Sarah continued. "Marcus became my partner, my protector, my best friend. He taught me how to stay calm under fire, how to make impossible decisions in the heat of battle. But, more than that, he showed me what it meant to serve others without counting the cost. The wind picked up, carrying the salt spray from the ocean across the deck where they stood. Sarah shivered, pulling the Admiral's jacket tighter around her shoulders. The physical cold was nothing compared to the chill that had settled in her heart as she prepared to tell Jake about the love they had found in the midst of war. "We tried to keep it professional at first," Sarah admitted. "Both of us knew the regulations about relationships in the field. But, being in that environment, facing life and death together every day, it created a bond that neither of us could ignore. Marcus was unlike anyone I had ever met. He was brave but not reckless, strong but incredibly gentle. He could make me laugh even when everything around us was falling apart." Jake felt a complex mixture of emotions as he listened. Pride in his brother warred with a jealousy he knew was irrational. Marcus was dead, had been dead for 5 years, but the love in Sarah's voice as she spoke about him made Jake feel like he was competing with a ghost for her affections. "He talked about you constantly," Sarah said, noticing the pain in Jake's expression. "You were his hero, his role model. He wanted nothing more than to make you proud, to live up to the example you had set. Every letter he wrote home, every phone call he made, you were the first thing he mentioned." The words hit Jake like physical blows. He had always thought of himself as the big brother who hadn't been there when it mattered most. The guilt of Marcus's death had eaten at him for 5 years, the knowledge that he had been safe in another country while his little brother was dying alone in a bombed-out building. But Sarah's words painted a different picture, one of a brother who had died knowing he was loved and admired. "The night before his final mission," Sarah continued, her voice barely above a whisper, "Marcus told me he was planning to ask you for your blessing when he came home. He wanted to marry me, Jake. He had it all planned out. He was going to surprise you with a visit, introduce us properly, ask you to be his best man." Jake's legs gave out, and he sank onto a nearby bench. The weight of what might have been crushed down on him like a physical force. His brother had found love, had found happiness in the darkest possible circumstances, and had been planning a future that would never come. All those dreams had died with Marcus in that building in Aleppo. "The mission that killed him," Jake said, his voice hollow. "I should have been there. I should have been leading that operation instead of the one I was on. If I had been there." "You couldn't have saved him," Sarah interrupted firmly, moving to sit beside Jake on the bench. The building was rigged with explosives. Marcus and 2 other soldiers were trying to evacuate civilians when the whole structure came down. Even if you had been there, you couldn't have changed what happened. But Jake wasn't ready to accept absolution. The guilt had been his constant companion for 5 years, and letting go of it felt like betraying Marcus's memory. "I promised our father I would protect him," he said. "Marcus was supposed to outlive me, supposed to have the family and the future that I never could. Instead, he died at 28 with all his dreams unfulfilled." Sarah reached out instinctively to comfort him, her hand covering his on the bench between them. The touch sent electricity through both of them, a reminder of the attraction that had been growing between them for months. But now that attraction was complicated by grief, guilt, and the shadow of the man they had both loved. "His dreams weren't unfulfilled," Sarah said softly. "Marcus knew love, real love. He knew what it felt like to make a difference, to save lives, to be part of something bigger than himself. And he knew that his brother was proud of him. In his last letter to me, he wrote about how excited he was to bring me home to meet the family he talked about so much." Jake looked at her for the first time since they had sat down, really looked at her. The woman beside him was beautiful, yes, but it was more than that. There was a strength in her that reminded him of warriors he had known, a compassion that shone through even in her pain. It was easy to see what Marcus had fallen in love with, and that realization made Jake's own feelings even more complicated. "Show me," Jake said suddenly. "The tattoo. I need to see it properly." Sarah hesitated, then slowly turned around and let Admiral Richardson's jacket slip from her shoulders. Her torn uniform exposed her back, and, through her thin undershirt, the tattoo was clearly visible. Jake moved closer, studying the intricate design that his brother's lover had chosen to permanently mark her body. The military dog tags were rendered in perfect detail, with Marcus's name, service number, and blood type clearly visible. The angel wings spread out from either side, each feather carefully shaded and highlighted. Below the tags, in flowing script, were the coordinates of the building where Marcus had died, along with the date. But it was the small details that broke Jake's heart: the tiny medical symbol worked into the wing design, the subtle cross that marked Marcus's faith, the small infinity symbol that spoke of love without end. "I got it done when I came home," Sarah explained, her voice thick with emotion. "I couldn't bear the thought of his sacrifice being forgotten, of him becoming just another name on a memorial wall. He saved so many people, Jake. He saved me in every way a person can be saved." Jake reached out without thinking, his fingers tracing the outline of the tattoo through Sarah's shirt. She shivered at his touch, and he pulled his hand back as if burned. The intimacy of the moment was overwhelming, charged with emotions neither of them knew how to process. "After he died," Sarah continued, "I couldn't function for months. I took leave, went home to my family, tried to figure out how to live in a world without him. The Navy offered me a transfer to a desk job, something safe and quiet where I could heal. But I couldn't take it. Marcus had died trying to save people, and I knew he would want me to continue that work." "So you came here," Jake said, understanding beginning to dawn. "To Coronado, to continue his work in a different way." Sarah nodded. "I developed the new trauma protocols as a tribute to him. Every life saved using those techniques is a life Marcus saved too. I thought if I could just keep working, keep serving, I could honor his memory and maybe find some peace." Jake stood abruptly, walking to the railing and gripping it with white knuckles. The ocean stretched endlessly before them, beautiful and indifferent to human suffering. He thought about the missions he had led, the men he had brought home, the lives that had been saved because of the protocols Sarah had developed. In a way, Marcus was still saving lives, still making a difference, through the woman he had loved. "I've been falling in love with you," Jake said suddenly, the words torn from him before he could stop them. "For months, I've been fighting feelings that I thought were wrong because of our professional relationship. Now I find out you were in love with my brother, that you carry his memory tattooed on your body. What kind of man does that make me?" Sarah turned to face him, tears streaming down her cheeks. "It makes you human," she said. "It makes you someone who doesn't know how to stop caring, just like your brother. Marcus talked about your capacity to love, how deeply you felt things even when you tried to hide it." The wind whipped around them, carrying the sounds of the naval base, helicopters in the distance, the sharp commands of drill instructors, the everyday sounds of military life. But, in their small bubble of revelation and pain, the world had narrowed to just the two of them and the ghost of the man who connected them. "I don't know what happens now," Jake admitted, his voice breaking. "I don't know how to move forward from here." Sarah stood and walked to stand beside him at the railing. They didn't touch, but the space between them hummed with tension and possibility. "Neither do I," she said. "All I know is that Marcus wouldn't want either of us to stop living because he's gone. He was too full of life for that, too determined to see others happy." They stood in silence for a long moment, each lost in their own thoughts. The ceremony was long over, and the base was settling into its afternoon routine. Soon, they would have to return to their duties, to the carefully constructed professional relationship that had been their safe harbor. But everything had changed, and there was no going back to the way things were before. The tattoo on Sarah's back seemed to pulse with meaning, a permanent reminder of love and loss, of dreams cut short and the courage to keep living. As the California sun began its descent toward the horizon, both Jake and Sarah wondered if it was possible to honor the memory of a dead man while still reaching for the possibility of new love. 3 weeks had passed since the ceremony, and the dynamic between Jake and Sarah had shifted into something neither could define. They maintained their professional relationship during the day, working together on training exercises and mission planning with the same efficiency they had always shared. But, beneath the surface, an undercurrent of tension and unspoken emotion made every interaction feel charged with possibility and danger. Sarah found herself avoiding Jake's eyes during briefings, afraid of what she might see there or what he might read in her own. The revelation of their connection through Marcus had created an intimacy between them that neither knew how to navigate. Every casual touch, every shared glance, every moment of laughter felt like a betrayal of Marcus's memory, yet also like the most natural thing in the world. Jake, for his part, was struggling with emotions he had never experienced before. The grief for his brother, which he thought he had processed years ago, had returned with fresh intensity. But, mixed with that grief was a growing awareness of Sarah as a woman, not just as his brother's former love. He found himself watching her during training sessions, noting the grace with which she moved, the confidence in her voice as she instructed new recruits, the way her eyes lit up when she successfully implemented a new life-saving technique. The breaking point came during a routine training exercise that turned into anything but routine. Jake was leading a team through a simulated hostage rescue scenario when one of the younger SEALs, Petty Officer Rodriguez, suffered a real injury during a fast rope insertion. The man had clipped his safety harness incorrectly and fell 20 feet onto concrete, suffering what appeared to be serious internal injuries. Sarah was the medical officer on call, and she responded to the emergency with the same calm efficiency that had made her legendary among the teams. Jake watched as she took control of the situation, her hands steady as she worked to stabilize Rodriguez while coordinating with the medical evacuation team. In that moment, seeing her save a life with such skill and compassion, Jake could understand exactly what his brother had fallen in love with. "Stay with me, Rodriguez," Sarah commanded, her voice firm but comforting as she worked. "You're going to be fine, but I need you to focus on my voice. Tell me about your girlfriend back home." The young SEAL, fighting to stay conscious through the pain, began talking about Maria, his high school sweetheart who was waiting for him to finish his deployment so they could get married. Sarah kept him talking while she worked, using conversation as both a diagnostic tool and a way to keep him alert. Jake found himself thinking about Marcus, about the conversations Sarah must have had with wounded soldiers in Syria, about the lives she had saved through sheer force of will and expertise. When the medical helicopter arrived and Rodriguez was successfully evacuated, Jake approached Sarah as she was cleaning up her equipment. She was shaking slightly, the adrenaline of the emergency finally catching up to her. Without thinking, Jake reached out and steadied her hands with his own. "You saved his life," he said quietly. "That was incredible work." Sarah looked up at him, and, for a moment, the professional mask slipped. "That's what Marcus would have done," she said. "Every time I work on someone, I can hear his voice guiding me, teaching me. Sometimes I think he's still here, still saving people through me." Jake felt something shift inside his chest at her words. The jealousy he had been fighting gave way to something deeper, a recognition that loving Sarah didn't diminish Marcus's memory, but honored it. His brother had seen something extraordinary in this woman, and Jake was beginning to understand what it was. That evening, Jake found himself knocking on Sarah's door at the officers' quarters. She answered in civilian clothes, jeans and a simple sweater that made her look younger and more vulnerable than her uniform ever did. For a moment, they just looked at each other, both aware that this visit represented a crossing of lines they had been carefully avoiding. "Can I come in?" Jake asked. "I think we need to talk." Sarah stepped aside, letting him into her small apartment. The space was neat and functional, but Jake noticed personal touches that revealed more about her than their professional interactions ever had. There were photos on the bookshelf, her family, her friends from medical school, and one picture of her with a group of soldiers that must have included Marcus. Jake's breath caught when he spotted his brother's familiar grin in the back row of the group photo. "That was taken 2 weeks before he died," Sarah said, noticing Jake's attention. "It was someone's birthday, and we actually had a few hours of downtime. Marcus was telling jokes, trying to make everyone laugh. He had this gift for finding light in the darkest places." Jake studied the photo more closely. His brother looked happy, relaxed in a way that Jake had rarely seen during their brief conversations via satellite phone. Marcus's arm was around Sarah's shoulders in the photo, but it was the look on his face as he gazed at her that told the real story. It was the expression of a man deeply in love, completely content with his world. "I've been thinking about what you said," Jake began, settling onto Sarah's small couch while she took the chair across from him. "About Marcus not wanting us to stop living. I think you're right, but I also think we need to face some hard truths about what's happening between us." Sarah tensed, clearly preparing for a conversation she had been dreading. "What do you mean?" "I mean that I'm falling in love with you," Jake said bluntly. "I've been fighting it for weeks, telling myself it's wrong, that it's a betrayal of Marcus's memory. But, watching you today, seeing you save Rodriguez's life with the same skill and compassion that Marcus talked about in his letters, I realized that fighting these feelings is the real betrayal." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "Jake, Let me finish," he interrupted gently. "I loved my brother. He was my hero long before he was anyone else's. But, he's gone, Sarah. He's been gone for 5 years, and we're still here. We're still breathing, still capable of feeling, still capable of loving. Doesn't he deserve to have the people he cared about find happiness?" Sarah stood abruptly, walking to the window that overlooked the Pacific. The ocean was dark under the evening sky, dotted with the lights of distant ships. "It's not that simple," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You don't understand the promises I made." Jake joined her at the window, standing close enough to catch the faint scent of her shampoo but careful not to touch her. "Then, help me understand." Sarah closed her eyes, gathering the courage to share a part of her story she had never told anyone. "The night before Marcus left for that final mission, we talked about the future. He made me promise that if anything happened to him, I wouldn't let grief destroy my life. He said he couldn't bear the thought of his death stealing away my chance at happiness." She paused, her breath fogging the window glass. "But, I also made him a promise. I promised that I would never love anyone the way I loved him, that what we had was unique and irreplaceable. I told him he would always be the love of my life, and I meant it." Jake felt his heart sink at her words, but he forced himself to really listen, to understand what she was telling him. "And now you feel like caring for me would break that promise. Wouldn't it?" Sarah turned to face him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "How can I say I love you when I have his name tattooed on my body? How can I move forward with his brother, of all people? It feels like I'm dishonoring everything we had." Jake was quiet for a long moment, considering his words carefully. "Can I tell you about the last conversation I had with Marcus?" Sarah nodded, settling back into her chair while Jake remained standing by the window. "It was 2 days before he died," Jake began. "He called me on the satellite phone, which wasn't unusual. But, this time was different. He sounded lighter somehow. Happier than I had heard him since he deployed. He told me about you, though he didn't mention your name at the time. He said he had met someone incredible, someone who understood him in a way no one ever had." Jake turned from the window to look at Sarah directly. "But, what he said next is what I think about every night. He said that loving you had taught him something important about the nature of love itself. He said love isn't finite, that it doesn't diminish by being shared. He said that watching you care for your patients, seeing how you could love strangers enough to risk your life for them, had shown him that the human heart has an unlimited capacity for love." Sarah's tears finally spilled over, running silently down her cheeks as Jake continued. "He also said something else," Jake added softly. "He said that if anything ever happened to him, he hoped you would find someone who could love you with the same intensity he did, because that's what you deserved. He said he couldn't bear the thought of you being alone." The apartment fell silent except for the distant sound of waves crashing against the shore. Sarah wiped her tears with the back of her hand, trying to process Jake's words. The Marcus he described sounded like the man she remembered, generous and selfless even in his deepest emotions. "I've been carrying so much guilt," Sarah admitted. "Not just about Marcus's death, but about the feelings I'd been developing for you. It seemed impossible that I could love two people so completely, but in such different ways." Jake moved from the window to kneel in front of Sarah's chair, taking her hands in his. "Maybe that's the point," he said. "Maybe love isn't about replacing what was lost, but about honoring it by staying open to new possibilities. What you felt for Marcus was real and beautiful and worth preserving. But that doesn't mean your heart can't expand to include new love." Sarah looked down at their joined hands, noting how right it felt to be touching Jake this way. His hands were larger than Marcus's had been, more calloused from years of combat operations. But the gentleness was the same, the careful strength that spoke of someone who understood both the power to destroy and the responsibility to protect. "I'm scared," she whispered. "Scared of dishonoring his memory, scared of getting my heart broken again, scared of what people will think." The SEAL community is small, Jake. People will talk. Let them talk, Jake said firmly. Anyone who knows our story, really knows it, will understand that this isn't about replacing Marcus or diminishing what you had with him. This is about two people who loved him finding a way to honor his memory while still living their own lives. Sarah studied Jake's face, seeing not just the man she was falling for, but echoes of the brother she had loved. They had the same dark eyes, the same strong jaw, the same capacity for loyalty that ran bone deep. But Jake was his own person, shaped by different experiences, carrying different scars. Loving him wouldn't be the same as loving Marcus, and that was exactly how it should be. There's something else you need to know, Sarah said, her voice stronger now. The coordinates on my tattoo, they're not just where Marcus died. They're where I scattered some of his ashes. Jake's eyes widened in surprise. I thought his body was never recovered, I know. But, before his final mission, Marcus gave me something. Sarah stood and walked to her dresser, opening a small wooden box that sat on top. Inside was a small vial of sand. He said it was from his favorite beach in California, from a place where your family used to vacation when you were kids. He said if anything happened to him, he wanted part of him to return to that peaceful place in Syria, to watch over the people there. Jake recognized the sand immediately. It was from Carmel Beach, where their parents had taken them every summer until their father's death. Marcus had always loved that beach, spending hours collecting shells and building sandcastles that were engineering marvels for a child his age. I mixed some of his sand with the soil at those coordinates and buried it there, Sarah continued. It felt like the right thing to do, like I was giving him the peace he deserved while keeping him close to the place where he had given his life for others. The gesture was so perfectly like something Marcus would have wanted that Jake felt his last defenses crumble. Sarah hadn't just loved his brother, she had understood him in a way that even Jake never had. She had honored Marcus's memory not just with a tattoo, but with actions that spoke to the very essence of who he had been. I think, Jake said slowly, that Marcus would want us to be happy. I think he would want the people he loved most to take care of each other. And I think he would be proud that his death led to something beautiful instead of just ending with grief. Sarah moved closer to Jake, reaching up to touch his face with gentle fingers. Are you sure about this? About us? Because once we cross this line, there's no going back. We'll be committed to figuring out how to love each other while honoring his memory. Jake covered her hand with his, turning his face to press a kiss to her palm. I've never been more sure of anything in my life. Marcus taught us both how to love deeply and how to fight for what matters. I want to fight for this, for us, for the future he would have wanted us to have. As the California moon rose over the Pacific, Sarah and Jake took their first tentative step toward a love that honored the past while embracing the possibility of tomorrow. The ghost of Marcus Torres would always be with them, not as a shadow that darkened their happiness, but as a blessing that had brought them together and taught them that true love multiplies rather than divides. 6 months had passed since that evening in Sarah's apartment when everything changed between them. Jake and Sarah had approached their relationship with the same careful precision they brought to military operations, understanding that they were navigating uncharted territory that required both courage and wisdom. They had agreed to take things slowly, to honor both their professional obligations and their emotional need to build something genuine rather than rushed. The SEAL community at Coronado had indeed noticed the subtle changes in their dynamic, but the reactions had been more supportive than either had expected. Most of their colleagues understood that warriors who had seen as much combat as Jake and Sarah had deserved whatever happiness they could find. The whispered conversations that did occur were generally positive, recognizing that two people who had both loved Marcus Torres deeply were perhaps the only ones who could truly understand each other's grief and growth. Sarah had established new protocols for their professional relationship, ensuring that their personal feelings never compromised their duties. During operations and training exercises, they maintained strict military bearing. But, in the quiet moments between their official responsibilities, they allowed their relationship to develop naturally, learning about each other in ways that went beyond their shared connection to Marcus. Jake discovered that Sarah was an accomplished pianist who had once considered a career in music before choosing medicine. She played for him sometimes in the evenings, her fingers dancing over the keys of the small keyboard in her apartment with the same precision she brought to surgery. The music she chose was often melancholy but beautiful, pieces that spoke to loss and hope in equal measure. Sarah learned that Jake wrote poetry in his spare time, verse that captured the complexity of military life and the weight of leadership. His poems were raw and honest, exploring themes of brotherhood, sacrifice, and the strange beauty that could be found in the darkest moments of human experience. When he finally showed her his work, she understood that beneath his tough exterior was a soul that felt everything deeply. Their first real test as a couple came when Jake was assigned to lead a high-risk mission in Eastern Europe. The operation was classified, but Sarah knew enough to understand that Jake would be going into dangerous territory with minimal backup and uncertain odds of success. The night before his departure, they sat together on the beach near the base, watching the waves roll endlessly toward shore. "I need you to know something," Sarah said, her hand finding his in the sand between them. "If something happens to you on this mission, I don't regret a single moment we've shared. You've given me something I thought I'd lost forever, the ability to love without fear." Jake squeezed her hand, understanding the weight of what she was telling him. After losing Marcus so suddenly, the courage it took for Sarah to open her heart again was extraordinary. "Nothing's going to happen to me," he said. "I have too much to come back to." "Promise me something," Sarah continued. "Promise me that you'll take every precaution, that you won't be reckless trying to prove something to Marcus's memory or to yourself. Your life has value beyond what you can accomplish in combat. You matter to me not because you're a warrior, but because you're Jake." The mission lasted 3 weeks, during which Sarah received only 2 brief messages confirming that Jake's team was operational and safe. The uncertainty was torture, made worse by the memories of waiting for news about Marcus that never came. She threw herself into her work, developing new emergency response protocols and training the next generation of Navy medics with an intensity that worried her colleagues. When Jake finally returned, tired but unharmed, Sarah met him at the airfield despite regulations that typically prohibited such displays of personal relationship in professional settings. She didn't care who saw her embrace him or what conclusions they drew. The relief of having him back safe was overwhelming, and she realized that somewhere in the months of careful courtship, she had fallen completely in love with Jake Torres for who he was, not just as Marcus's brother. Jake felt the same transformation. Holding Sarah in his arms after 3 weeks of uncertainty, he knew that what they had built together was entirely separate from their shared love for Marcus. She was no longer just the woman his brother had loved, she was the woman Jake loved, completely and independently. Their relationship deepened after that mission, moving from cautious exploration to genuine commitment. They began spending most evenings together, sharing meals and conversation that ranged from military strategy to philosophy to plans for the future they were tentatively beginning to envision together. It was during one of these quiet dinners that Sarah brought up the subject they had both been avoiding. "I've been thinking about something," she said, setting down her fork and looking directly at Jake. "I want to visit Marcus's grave." Jake's expression grew serious. Marcus was buried in Arlington National Cemetery, an honor befitting his service and sacrifice. Jake had visited several times over the years, but never with Sarah. The thought of bringing her there, of standing together at his brother's grave, felt both right and terrifying. "I think it's time," Sarah continued. "I need to tell him about us, about what we've found together. I need his blessing, or at least I need to believe that he would approve of what we're building." Jake nodded slowly. "I've been thinking the same thing. I feel like we're living in a space between grief and joy, and I think Marcus is the key to finding peace with that." They arranged for leave during the Memorial Day weekend, flying to Washington, D.C. together for what they both understood would be a pivotal moment in their relationship. The flight was quiet, both lost in their own thoughts about what they hoped to accomplish at Arlington. The cemetery was beautiful in late spring, the rolling hills covered with white headstones that stretched as far as the eye could see. Each marker represented a life given in service to country, a story of sacrifice that connected to countless other stories of loss and heroism. Jake led Sarah through the precise rows to Section 60, where the newest casualties of America's conflicts were laid to rest. Marcus's grave was simple but dignified, his headstone bearing his name, rank, dates of service, and the medals he had earned. Someone had left fresh flowers recently, probably their mother, Jake realized, who still visited regularly despite living in Texas. The sight of the grave hit Sarah harder than she had expected, making the finality of Marcus's death real in a way that even her tattoo had never quite accomplished. Jake stood slightly behind Sarah, watching as she approached the headstone. She knelt in the grass, placing her hand on the warm marble and closing her eyes. For several minutes, she was silent, and Jake gave her the privacy she needed for whatever conversation she was having with his brother's memory. When Sarah finally spoke aloud, her voice was soft but clear. "Hello, Marcus. I'm sorry it took me so long to visit you here. I've been to the place where you died, but I needed time before I could come to where you rest." Jake felt his throat tighten as Sarah continued talking to the grave as if Marcus could hear every word. "I want you to know that your brother is everything you said he was," Sarah said. "He's brave and kind and funny, just like you. But he's also his own person, different from you in ways that make me love him for who he is, not just because he shares your blood." She paused, wiping tears from her cheeks before continuing. "I know I promised you that you would always be the love of my life, and that's still true. You were my first real love, the one who taught me what it meant to give my heart completely to another person. But Jake has shown me that love doesn't have limits, that my heart is big enough to hold what I felt for you and what I feel for him." Jake stepped closer, kneeling beside Sarah in the grass. He placed his hand on the headstone next to hers, feeling the solid reality of his brother's final resting place. "Hey, little brother," Jake said, his voice rough with emotion. "I hope you're at peace, wherever you are. I want you to know that I'm taking care of her, the way you would have wanted. But, more than that, she's taking care of me too. She's teaching me how to love without fear, how to be vulnerable without being weak." Sarah leaned against Jake's shoulder as they knelt together at the grave. The physical contact felt right, natural, as if Marcus was somehow blessing their union with his presence. "I love her, Marcus," Jake continued. "I love her the way you did, completely, without reservation. But I also love her differently, because I'm not you. I'm going to spend my life making sure she knows how precious she is, how grateful I am that you brought us together even though you're gone." They stayed at the grave for over an hour, talking sometimes to Marcus, sometimes to each other, sometimes sitting in comfortable silence. As the afternoon sun began to set, Sarah felt a sense of peace that she hadn't experienced since Marcus's death. It was as if his spirit had finally given them permission to move forward without guilt. As they prepared to leave, Sarah touched the headstone one more time. "Thank you," she whispered. "For loving me, for teaching Jake how to love, for bringing us together. I promise we'll live the kind of life you would have wanted for us." Walking away from the grave hand in hand, Jake and Sarah both felt that they had crossed an important threshold. The ghost of Marcus Torres would always be part of their story, but it was no longer a presence that haunted them. Instead, it had become a blessing that connected them to something larger than themselves. That evening, in their hotel room overlooking the Potomac River, Jake asked Sarah to marry him. He had been carrying his grandmother's ring for weeks, waiting for the right moment to propose. After their visit to Arlington, after the conversation with Marcus's memory, he knew that the time had come. "I don't want to wait any longer," Jake said, dropping to one knee beside the bed where Sarah was sitting. "Life is too uncertain, too precious to waste time being afraid. I want to build a life with you, to honor Marcus's memory by living fully and loving completely." Sarah looked at the ring, a simple but elegant design that spoke of enduring love and timeless commitment. Through her tears, she could see not just Jake kneeling before her, but the future they could create together. A future that honored the past while embracing new possibilities. "Yes," she said, her voice strong and certain. "Yes, I'll marry you. I want to build that life too, to show the world that love really can triumph over loss." As Jake slipped the ring onto her finger, Sarah felt the weight of her tattoo shift somehow. Marcus's name would always be part of her story, permanently marked on her skin and in her heart. But now it represented not just grief and loss, but also the bridge that had led her to a new kind of love. The coordinates beneath his name on her back would always mark where he had died, but they would also mark the beginning of her journey toward Jake. Outside their window, the lights of Washington, D.C. twinkled like stars, and the Potomac River flowed endlessly toward the sea. Tomorrow they would return to California and begin planning their wedding, but tonight they simply held each other and marveled at the strange and beautiful ways that love could grow from the ashes of loss. 1 year later, the same California sun that had exposed Sarah's tattoo during that fateful ceremony now shone down on her wedding day. She stood in the bridal suite at the historic Hotel del Coronado, looking at herself in the mirror while her sister Emma helped with the final touches on her dress. The gown was elegant but simple, with a flowing silhouette that would accommodate the special modifications Sarah had requested and open back that would display her tattoo with pride rather than shame. Emma paused in her work on Sarah's hair, meeting her sister's eyes in the mirror. "Are you sure about this?" she asked gently. "Having the tattoo visible during the ceremony? People will see it, they'll know about Marcus." Sarah's reflection smiled back at her, radiant with a piece that had been years in the making. "That's exactly the point," she said. "Marcus is part of this story, part of who Jake and I are together. Hiding him would be like denying the journey that brought us here." The tattoo had been subtly modified since that day at Arlington Cemetery. Working with a talented artist in San Diego, Sarah had added small elements that honored her new life while preserving the memorial to her first love. Angel wings now extended from both sides of Marcus's dog tag, and, beneath the original coordinates, new ones had been added, the exact location where Jake had proposed to her on the beach at Coronado. The infinity symbol that had represented her eternal love for Marcus now connected to a second infinity symbol, representing the endless nature of love itself. A soft knock on the door interrupted Sarah's thoughts. "Come in," Emma called, and, to their surprise, Admiral Richardson entered the room. He was in full dress uniform, his chest decorated with the ribbons and medals that spoke of a distinguished career in service to his country. "Commander Mitchell," he said formally, then smiled. "Or should I say, future Mrs. Torres. I hope you don't mind the interruption, but I wanted to speak with you before the ceremony." Sarah turned from the mirror, surprised but pleased to see him. Admiral Richardson had been instrumental in supporting her career and had become something of a mentor over the years. His presence at her wedding felt like a blessing from the Navy family that had shaped so much of her life. "I have something for you," the Admiral continued, pulling a small velvet box from his pocket. "It's from the families of the men whose lives were saved by the medical protocols you developed. They wanted you to have this as a wedding gift." Sarah opened the box to find a delicate necklace with a small pendant shaped like a medical cross. But, as she looked closer, she realized that the cross was made from reclaimed metal pieces of equipment from the field hospital where she and Marcus had worked together in Syria. The families somehow managed to recover some of the medical equipment that was damaged in the bombing that killed Marcus, Admiral Richardson explained. They had it melted down and crafted into this pendant. They said they wanted you to carry a piece of that place with you always, to remember that some things destroyed in war can be transformed into something beautiful. Sarah's hands shook as she lifted the necklace from the box. The weight of it was significant, both physically and emotionally. Here was a tangible connection to the place where she had first learned to love, where Marcus had died, and where her journey toward Jake had unknowingly begun. "Would you help me put it on?" she asked Admiral Richardson, her voice thick with emotion. As the Admiral clasped the necklace around her neck, Sarah felt a sense of completion she hadn't expected. The pendant rested just below her collarbone, visible above the neckline of her wedding dress. Together with her tattoo, it created a visual representation of her complete story: love found, love lost, love transformed, and love renewed. Admiral Richardson stepped back, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "You look beautiful, Sarah. Marcus would be proud, and Jake is a lucky man." After the Admiral left, Sarah and Emma finished the final preparations. As Sarah applied her lipstick, she thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. 5 years ago, she had been broken by loss, convinced that her capacity for love had died with Marcus in that Syrian building. Today, she was about to marry a man who had taught her that the human heart could expand infinitely, that honoring the past didn't require sacrificing the future. Meanwhile, in the groom's suite across the hotel, Jake was having his own moment of reflection. He stood before a mirror, adjusting his dress uniform with the help of his best man, Chief Petty Officer Mike Sullivan, one of his oldest friends from the teams. The uniform was the same one he had worn to Marcus's memorial service 5 years ago, but today it felt different, lighter somehow, as if the weight of grief had been transformed into something more manageable. "You nervous?" Mike asked, straightening Jake's medals with the precision of a man who understood the importance of military bearing. Jake considered the question seriously. "No," he said, somewhat surprised by his own answer. "I should be, right? This is the biggest decision of my life. But I feel certain. Like this is exactly what I'm supposed to be doing, exactly where I'm supposed to be." Mike smiled, stepping back to admire his work. "That's how you know it's right. When it feels like destiny instead of a choice." Jake's thoughts turned to his brother, as they often did during important moments. He could almost feel Marcus's presence, could imagine his younger brother's excitement about the wedding, his joy at seeing Jake find happiness with the woman he had loved so deeply. In quiet moments over the past year, Jake had sometimes felt as though he was living not just his own life, but fulfilling some of the dreams that Marcus would never get to pursue. The ceremony was set to take place on the beach at sunset, with the Pacific Ocean providing a backdrop that seemed to stretch into infinity. As guests began to gather, Jake noticed the careful attention that had been paid to honoring Marcus's memory throughout the event. Sarah had insisted on having an empty chair in the front row, draped with a flag and marked with a small photo of Marcus in uniform. It was a visible reminder that some absences are so profound they become a presence of their own. Jake's mother, Elena Torres, had flown in from Texas for the wedding. At 68, she carried the dignity of a woman who had buried her husband and one of her sons but had refused to let grief define her entirely. As she took her place in the front row, she touched the photo of Marcus gently, whispering a prayer in Spanish that Jake couldn't hear but understood in his heart. Sarah's parents, Dr. Robert Mitchell and Professor Helen Mitchell, sat across the aisle. They had initially been concerned about their daughter marrying into a military family, knowing too well the sacrifices and risks that such a life entailed. But meeting Jake had reassured them that their daughter was choosing a man who understood both the cost of service and the value of the love they were fighting to protect. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, the processional began. Emma walked down the aisle first, her dress a soft blue that complemented the ocean backdrop. She was followed by Jake's cousin Maria, who had served as a bridesmaid despite having met Sarah only a few times. The Torres family was small and tight-knit, and they had welcomed Sarah with the same fierce loyalty they showed each other. Admiral Richardson had agreed to officiate the ceremony, using the special privileges granted to military commanders for such occasions. As he took his place at the makeshift altar, a simple arch decorated with white roses and navy blue ribbons, the assembled guests fell silent. Jake walked down the aisle alone, as was military tradition, his steps measured and confident. He took his place beside Admiral Richardson and turned to watch for his bride, his heart full of anticipation and gratitude. The music changed, and Sarah appeared at the top of the beach path. She walked alone as well, having chosen to give herself away rather than be given by her father. The symbolism was important to her. This marriage was her choice, her decision to trust love again after loss. As she moved down the aisle, the open back of her dress revealed her tattoo to the assembled guests, and Jake heard the soft gasps and murmurs of appreciation for her courage in displaying such a personal memorial so publicly. But Jake's attention was entirely focused on Sarah's face. She was luminous with joy, her smile radiant as their eyes met across the distance between them. In that moment, Jake felt a profound sense of rightness, as if all the pain and loss and struggle of the past 5 years had been leading to this single perfect moment. When Sarah reached the altar, she handed her bouquet to Emma and turned to face Jake fully. Admiral Richardson began the ceremony with words he had crafted specifically for their unique situation, acknowledging the journey that had brought them together and the love they had both lost and found. "We are gathered here today," Admiral Richardson began, "not just to witness the union of Jake and Sarah, but to celebrate the triumph of love over loss, of hope over despair, of the human capacity to heal and grow and love again. This ceremony is blessed by the memory of a fallen warrior who loved them both, and whose legacy lives on in the love they have found together." Jake and Sarah had written their own vows, words that spoke to their specific journey and the promises they wanted to make to each other. When it came time for Jake to speak, his voice was clear and strong despite the emotion he felt. "Sarah," he began, "5 years ago, I thought I understood what love was. I loved my country, I loved my brothers in arms, I loved my family. But, you've taught me that love is not a finite resource to be carefully rationed, but an infinite force that grows stronger when shared. You've shown me that honoring the past doesn't require sacrificing the future, that grief can be transformed into gratitude, that loss can lead to unexpected blessings. He paused, looking out at the ocean where the sun was beginning to touch the horizon. I promise to love you not as a replacement for what was lost, but as a celebration of what has been found. I promise to honor Marcus's memory by living fully, by loving completely, by never taking for granted the precious gift of our time together. I promise to be your partner in all things, your protector when you need shelter, your supporter when you need strength, and your friend when you need laughter. Sarah's vows were equally powerful, acknowledging the complexity of their situation while affirming the certainty of her love. Jake, she said, her voice carrying clearly across the beach, you've given me something I thought I'd lost forever, the courage to love without fear. You've shown me that my heart is large enough to hold multiple loves, that honoring Marcus's memory doesn't require me to live in the past. She reached up to touch the pendant at her throat, then gestured toward her exposed tattoo. I wear Marcus's name on my body and carry his memory in my heart, but I choose to build my future with you. I promise to love you for who you are, not for who you remind me of. I promise to stand beside you through whatever challenges our service may bring. I promise to create a life with you that Marcus would be proud of, a love story that honors his memory while writing new chapters of our own. When it came time for the ring exchange, Jake surprised Sarah by producing not just her wedding band, but a second ring, a simple band that matched his own. This is for Marcus, he explained quietly, placing it beside the photo at the empty chair. So he can be part of this moment too. The gesture broke down the last of Sarah's emotional defenses, and she wept openly as Admiral Richardson pronounced them husband and wife. When Jake kissed her for the first time as her husband, the setting sun cast them in golden light, and the ocean waves provided a soundtrack of eternal rhythm and renewal. As the reception began on the hotel terrace, Jake and Sarah took a few moments alone on the beach. They walked hand in hand along the water's edge, their formal attire a stark contrast to the casual setting but somehow perfectly appropriate for two people who had learned to find beauty in unexpected places. Do you think he approves? Sarah asked, looking out at the endless ocean where the last traces of sunset were fading into starlight. Jake squeezed her hand, certain of his answer. I think he's been waiting for this day almost as much as we have. I think he's finally at peace, knowing that the people he loves most have found their way to each other. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the first stars appear in the darkening sky. The tattoo on Sarah's back seemed to glow in the moonlight, no longer a mark of grief but a symbol of love's power to transcend death, to connect souls across time and loss, to transform tragedy into blessing. Later that evening, as they danced to their first song as husband and wife, a piece Sarah had played for Jake on her piano during their courtship, both felt the presence of Marcus Torres like a benediction. He was there in Jake's protective embrace, in Sarah's radiant smile, in the love that had grown from the ashes of loss into something beautiful and new. The tattoo that had once been exposed by accident in a moment of vulnerability was now displayed by choice in a moment of triumph. Marcus's name would always be part of Sarah's story, but it was no longer the ending. Instead, it had become the bridge to a new chapter, a love that honored the past while embracing an infinite future. As the Pacific waves continued their eternal dance with the shore, Jake and Sarah Torres began their married life with the blessing of a fallen hero and the promise of love that knows no bounds. The coordinates tattooed on Sarah's back would always mark the place where one love story ended, but they had become the starting point for another, a love story that proved that sometimes the most beautiful things grow not despite our scars, but because of them.